Everyone in courtroom 4 was laughing. Not loudly. Not all at once. It was worse than that. It was the low, comfortable laughter of people who believed they already knew how the story would end. Daniel Ashworth sat behind the plaintiff's table in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair beside him, where Vivian Cole sat with her legs crossed and her lips curved into a smile she did not bother to hide. She wore a coat the color of champagne. She wore it the way a woman wears a trophy, tilting her chin just enough so the room could see it. Behind them, in the gallery, Daniel's colleagues from Ashworth Dynamics sat in a neat row, whispering to each other, glancing over their shoulders at the woman who sat alone at the defendant's table, with nothing in front of her but a single manila folder and her own 2 hands. Her name was Margaret Hale. Everyone called her Maggie. She wore a gray cardigan that had been washed so many times the color had gone soft, and flat shoes that made no sound when she walked. She had no lawyer beside her. She had not hired one. When the court clerk had asked, at the very beginning, whether she wished to request a continuance to secure representation, she had simply shaken her head and said, quietly, that she was ready. The gallery had laughed at that too. Daniel's attorney, a sharp, silver-haired man named Preston Vance, who had a reputation for turning divorce proceedings into public executions, stood at the podium with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already won 100 cases like this one and expected to win this one before lunch. "Your Honor," Vance said, "we are here today because my client, a man who built one of the most successful technology companies on the Eastern Seaboard from a garage apartment with $4,000 and an idea, is being asked to divide the fruits of that labor with a woman who, and I say this with no cruelty intended, contributed nothing to its creation." A ripple of laughter again. Someone in the 3rd row did not even try to hide it. Maggie did not flinch. She sat with her hands folded on the table, her eyes steady, watching the judge rather than the man who was speaking about her, as though she were a line item to be subtracted from a balance sheet. The judge, the Honorable Eleanor Faust, sat very still at the bench. She was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of face that gave away nothing. She had presided over more divorce cases than she could count, had watched hundreds of marriages dissolve into accusations and inventories, and she had learned, over 3 decades on the bench, that the people who laughed loudest in her courtroom were rarely the ones who understood what was actually happening. She noticed something the gallery did not. She noticed that Maggie Hale had not looked away once, not when Vance raised his voice, not when Vivian Cole let out a soft, delighted laugh, not when Daniel leaned back in his chair with the satisfied posture of a man who had already spent the money in his head. She noticed the folder in front of Maggie. It was thin, it was plain, and Maggie's hand rested on top of it, the way a person rests a hand on something they intend to use only when the moment is right. Judge Faust made a note on her legal pad. Then she looked up and said, in a voice that carried without ever rising, "Mr. Vance, you may continue. But I would remind everyone in this courtroom that we are here to determine facts, not to entertain an audience." The laughter stopped. For a moment, it would not stay stopped for long. Not yet. Not until they understood exactly who Margaret Hale was. Because everyone in that courtroom believed they were watching a poor woman about to lose everything. They had no idea they were about to watch history. Judge Faust had seen thousands of defendants sit at that table over 28 years, some guilty of nothing more than loving the wrong person too completely, others guilty of far worse, and she had long ago stopped trying to guess, from posture alone, which kind of story she was about to witness. But something about the particular quality of Maggie Hale's silence, patient rather than defeated, watchful rather than cowed, had already told her, before a single document was ever produced, that this was not going to be an ordinary Monday morning divorce hearing. She simply had no idea yet exactly how extraordinary it was about to become. To understand how Margaret Hale ended up sitting alone at a defendant's table while a courtroom laughed at her, you have to go back 11 years, to a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Queens, where a 26-year-old woman named Maggie stirred a pot of rice on a hot plate while her boyfriend paced back and forth across 400 square feet, muttering numbers to himself. Daniel Ashworth had been rejected by investors 9 times that year. She remembered every one of those nights. She remembered the particular sound he made when he came home from a pitch meeting that had gone badly, a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a growl, the sound of a man swallowing his own humiliation because he had nowhere else to put it. She remembered sitting across from him at their small kitchen table, a table they had found on the street and sanded down themselves, listening to him explain, for the fourth time that week, why the algorithm he had built for predictive supply chain logistics was going to change the way the entire retail industry operated, if only someone would give him the chance to prove it. She believed him before anyone else did. She was not an engineer. She could not write a single line of the code that would eventually become the backbone of Ashworth Dynamics. But she could do other things. She stayed up until 3 a.m, helping him rehearse his pitch deck, asking him the hard questions investors would ask, so that by the time he stood in front of them, nothing could surprise him. She read every contract before he signed it, twice, because she had grown up around lawyers and knew how easily an ambitious young man could sign away pieces of his future without understanding what the language actually meant. She learned to cook meals that stretched for 3 days because there was no money for anything else. She took a job as a receptionist at a law firm in Midtown, not because she loved the work, but because the health insurance covered them both, and because someone needed a steady paycheck while Daniel chased something that might never pay him a single dollar. She never told him about her family. Her mother had died when she was 19. Her father had died 2 years before that. And her grandfather, Charles Whitfield Hale, a man whose name had once appeared on the boards of half a dozen companies, and whose fortune had been built over 60 years of shipping, real estate, and a stake in an early telecommunications firm that had made him wealthier than most people could imagine, had raised her for the final years of her childhood in a house so large she used to get lost in it. She never spoke of any of it, not to Daniel, not to anyone, because she had learned, long before she met him, exactly what happened to a young woman when people found out what she was worth. She had watched it happen to her older cousin, who had married a man that turned out to love her trust fund considerably more than he loved her, and who had spent 6 years of her life extracting money from her before finally leaving with what remained. Maggie had watched that unfold from a distance, watched her cousin's face grow tired and suspicious of every person who was kind to her, and she had made a private decision, sitting in the back pew of her grandfather's funeral at the age of 22, that whatever life she built for herself, it would be built on being loved for exactly who she was, and nothing else. So when she met Daniel Ashworth at a coffee shop near Columbia, where he was hunched over a laptop arguing quietly with himself about a line of code, she told him her name was Maggie Hale, and that she worked at a law firm, and that her family was gone. All 3 things were true. She simply left out the part where the law firm had been chosen because her trust fund's oversight attorney worked 2 floors above her desk, and the part where family gone meant her parents and grandfather had died, not that there was no family fortune sitting untouched in a trust that would not release a single dollar to her until specific, sealed conditions were met. She fell in love with him slowly, the way you fall in love with someone you watch struggle and refuse to quit. She fell in love with the version of him that existed before the money, before the funding, before the company was worth anything at all. That was the man she married, in a courthouse, with 2 witnesses pulled from the hallway, wearing a dress she had bought for $40 because neither of them could imagine spending more. That was the man she thought she knew. She remembered, especially, the 7th rejection, because it was the one that had nearly ended everything before it began. Daniel had come home that night and had not said a single word for almost 2 hours, simply sitting on the edge of their bed in the dark, and when she finally sat down beside him and asked what had happened, he had told her, in a voice flattened by exhaustion, that the investor had not simply passed on the deal. He had told Daniel, directly, that he did not believe someone from his background, no formal engineering degree, no established network, no family money to fall back on if things failed, had any real chance of executing an idea this ambitious. He had said it kindly, which had somehow made it worse, the particular cruelty of rejection delivered as concerned advice. "Maybe he's right," Daniel had said. "Maybe I'm not the kind of person this works for." Maggie had not offered him easy comfort that night. She had learned, by then, that easy comfort rarely stuck, that platitudes dissolved by morning, while specific, concrete reasoning tended to last. So instead, she had walked to their small kitchen table, pulled out the notebook where he had been tracking every rejection, every piece of feedback, every version of the pitch deck he had revised after each failed meeting, and she had gone through it with him, line by line, for 3 hours. "Look at this," she had said, pointing to his notes from the 2nd rejection. "You didn't have a clear customer acquisition strategy. You fixed that by the 4th pitch. Look at the 5th rejection. They said your technical explanation was too dense for a non-technical partner to follow. You simplified it, and the sixth meeting went 20 minutes longer than any pitch before it, because they were actually engaged instead of confused. You are not the same founder who walked into that first meeting 11 months ago. You are getting better every single time, whether or not any individual investor can see it yet. This man tonight didn't reject your idea. He rejected a version of confidence you haven't fully built yet, and confidence is the only thing on this list that isn't actually about your product at all. Daniel had looked at her for a long moment in the dim light of their kitchen, something shifting behind his exhausted eyes. "How do you always know exactly what to say?" he had asked quietly. "I don't," she had told him honestly. "I just refuse to let you believe the worst version of a story when there's a truer one sitting right here in your own notes, if you're willing to actually look at it instead of just feeling it." 3 months and 2 rejections later, Halbrook Ventures had said yes. She had never once, in all the years since, heard him tell that particular story in an interview or a keynote, the story of the 7th rejection and the 3 hours at the kitchen table that came after it. He told, instead, a cleaner version, the version where his own persistence alone had carried him through, a version that was not exactly a lie, but was not exactly the whole truth either, the way most origin stories eventually smooth themselves into something a little more flattering than the messier reality that actually happened. Back in Courtroom 4, Preston Vance was building his case with the practiced rhythm of a man who had given this exact speech, in one form or another, dozens of times before. "Mrs. Hale," he said, turning toward her for the first time, using her married name with a faint emphasis that made it sound almost like an accusation, "you were employed as a receptionist for the first 3 years of this marriage." "Is that correct?" "Yes," Maggie said. "And for the last 8 years, you have not held any employment at all. Is that also correct?" "Yes." "So, for 8 years, while my client built a company now valued, conservatively, at $420 million, you did what, exactly?" There was a pause. Vance let it stretch, let the silence do the work for him, let the gallery lean forward. "I ran our household," Maggie said. "I managed our home. I supported Daniel's work. And for a period of time, I helped manage correspondence and scheduling for the company before it could afford to hire someone to do that formally." "You helped manage correspondence," Vance repeated, letting a small smile touch the corner of his mouth. "For how long? 6 months? A year?" 14 months. 14 months, he said, as though tasting the phrase. "And in exchange for those 14 months, you believe you are entitled to what, Mrs. Hale? Half of a company you have not set foot inside in over 6 years?" Vivian Cole let out a short laugh from the plaintiff's table, quickly covering her mouth with a manicured hand, though not quickly enough to hide the amusement in her eyes. Daniel did not laugh. He simply watched Maggie with an expression that was somehow worse than mockery, a flat, unbothered certainty that this was already over, that the outcome had been decided the moment his lawyers filed the paperwork. "I am entitled," Maggie said, and for the first time, her voice carried a weight that made a few people in the gallery stop whispering, "to what the law says I am entitled to, and to nothing more than that." "How modest," Vance said. "Mr. Vance," Judge Faust said, without looking up from her notes, "you will address the witness with the respect this court requires, or I will hold you in contempt before your coffee gets cold. Choose quickly." A ripple went through the gallery. Vance straightened his jacket, cleared his throat, and continued, though with slightly less theater in his voice. "Let us discuss the prenuptial agreement," he said. At this, Daniel finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, watching Maggie with something that looked almost like anticipation, as though this was the part he had been waiting for. "There was no prenuptial agreement," Maggie said. "We were married in a courthouse. Neither of us had anything to protect at the time." "Correct," Vance said, "which is precisely the point I intend to make, Your Honor. My client entered this marriage with nothing. He built everything that exists today from his own labor, his own intelligence, and his own risk. Mrs. Hale's contribution, however sentimentally significant it may have been, was domestic in nature and does not entitle her to equity in a company she had no hand in building." "Your Honor," Maggie said, before Vance could continue toward his binder, "may I respond to something Mr. Vance said a moment ago?" Judge Faust considered her for a moment. "Briefly, Mrs. Hale. Mr. Vance described my contribution as, quote, sentimentally significant, but not economically meaningful," Maggie said. "I'd like the record to reflect a few specific facts before this court accepts that characterization. In the 3rd year of our marriage, I identified a licensing clause in a contract with Belmore Freight that would have signed away the exclusive rights to any technology Ashworth Dynamics developed for the following 12 years. That correction alone protected value that, by the company's own later public filings, exceeded $130 million. I also secured, through a personal professional relationship unrelated to my husband's business, the introduction that became the company's third paying client, a relationship that generated over $4 million in revenue across 6 years and served as the primary case study in every institutional pitch deck the company used to raise its subsequent funding rounds. I do not say this to suggest these contributions entitle me to equity today. I say it because I would like the court, and everyone in this room, to stop describing 11 years of my life as sentimental. The gallery, which had been laughing only minutes earlier, had gone notably quiet. Vance recovered quickly, though with slightly less certainty in his voice than before. Your Honor, even accepting these characterizations as accurate, and we do not concede that they are, contract review and casual introductions do not constitute the kind of sustained professional labor that would entitle a spouse to an equity stake in a company she never held formal employment or ownership within. I'm not asking for equity, Mr. Vance, Maggie said calmly. I have said that clearly, and I will say it again. I am asking this court to calculate a fair settlement using an accurate accounting of what actually happened during this marriage, rather than the version your client's legal strategy would prefer to tell. Judge Faust made a note, longer than her previous ones, and looked up at Vance with an expression that had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, since the hearing began. Mr. Vance, I would suggest you proceed carefully with your next characterization of Mrs. Hale's contributions. This court is listening rather closely now. Vance cleared his throat, adjusted the binder in his hands, and continued with noticeably more caution than he had shown at the start of the hearing. Regardless of the specific value of Mrs. Hale's various contributions, he said, my client's position remains that the vast majority of Ashworth Dynamics' current valuation derives from intellectual and strategic labor performed exclusively by Mr. Ashworth. After the marriage's early years, during a period when Mrs. Hale was, by her own prior testimony, not formally employed by or involved in the company's operations. He turned, walked back toward his table, and picked up a thick binder, setting it down in front of the judge with a small, satisfied thud. We have prepared a full accounting of the marital estate, he said. We are prepared to offer Mrs. Hale a settlement of $200,000, a generous sum given the brevity of her professional involvement in my client's success, and we ask the court to finalize the dissolution of this marriage on those terms today. $200,000. Someone in the gallery whistled softly, as though it were an act of great generosity rather than an insult dressed up as one. Maggie looked at the binder sitting on the judge's bench. She looked at Daniel, who was watching her now with an expression that dared her to object, dared her to make a scene, dared her to prove every unkind thing he had ever silently believed about her. She thought about 14 years. She thought about the woman she had chosen to be, and the woman she had chosen never to reveal, and she reached down, slowly, and opened the manila folder in front of her. Inside the folder was a single sealed envelope, cream-colored, heavier than ordinary paper, with a wax seal pressed into the flap. She did not open it. She simply lifted it and held it in both hands. Your Honor, she said, before this court finalizes any settlement, I would like to submit this to the record. Vance's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes flickered. Your Honor, if opposing counsel, he stopped himself. If Mrs. Hale wishes to submit a document, she may hand it to the clerk like anyone else. I'm not opposing counsel, Maggie said quietly. I don't have one. A few people in the gallery laughed at that too, though it landed differently this time, uncertain, the laughter of people who were no longer entirely sure what they were watching. The bailiff crossed the room and took the envelope from her hands, carrying it up to the bench. Judge Faust turned it over once, studying the seal, running her thumb along the edge of it the way a person examines something they have not seen very often in a modern courtroom. An actual wax seal, pressed with a signet rather than printed. What is this, Mrs. Hale? The judge asked. I would ask the court to have it examined by a certified authenticator before it is opened, Maggie said. It concerns matters that have significant legal weight, and I want there to be no question, later, about whether it was tampered with. Daniel let out a short laugh, the first sound he had made in several minutes. Your Honor, with respect, this is theater. My wife, He caught himself on the word, corrected it with visible irritation. My soon-to-be ex-wife does not have significant legal matters. She has a checking account and a library card. That's enough, Mr. Ashworth, Judge Faust said, though there was something in her tone now that had not been there before, a note of genuine attention rather than routine patience. She looked down at the envelope again, then back at Maggie. This court will not open sealed documents on a whim, Mrs. Hale. I will grant a 48-hour continuance to have this examined by the court's document authentication office, and we will reconvene Thursday morning to determine its relevance. Is that acceptable to you? Yes, Your Honor, Maggie said. Thank you. Your Honor, Vance said, stepping forward. We object. This is clearly a delay tactic, a last-ditch attempt by Mrs. Hale to draw out a proceeding whose outcome is not in question. Mr. Vance, Judge Faust said, I have been on this bench for 28 years, and in that time, I have developed a fairly reliable instinct for delay tactics. This does not feel like one to me. Your objection is noted and overruled. We reconvene Thursday at 9. She struck her gavel once, and the courtroom began to empty in a hum of whispered speculation. Daniel did not move right away. He sat at the plaintiff's table, watching Maggie gather the empty folder and rise from her chair, and for just a moment, something crossed his face that was not quite confidence anymore. It was closer to a question, as though, for the first time in a very long while, he was not entirely sure what was coming next. Vivian leaned toward him and murmured something, and he laughed, shaking his head, the flicker of doubt smoothing itself back into certainty. But Judge Eleanor Faust, gathering her own notes at the bench, glanced once more toward the door where Maggie Hale had just exited without a single backward look, and made a decision she rarely made in her courtroom. She decided to have the envelope examined herself, tonight, rather than waiting for the morning staff. Something about the woman's stillness had told her this was not going to be an ordinary Thursday. There was a particular night Maggie thought about often in the years after everything fell apart, a night that had nothing to do with contracts or courtrooms, and everything to do with the quieter, less glamorous work of building someone else's future. It was the autumn after Halbrook Ventures had said yes. When Daniel needed introductions, he did not yet know how to secure himself. Connections to the kind of enterprise clients who did not respond to cold emails from an unproven startup, but who might, possibly, respond to a warm introduction from someone they already trusted. Maggie had spent 3 years at her receptionist job at Callaway and Reyes, long enough to have quietly built relationships with a handful of partners who liked her, who trusted her judgment in the small, unglamorous ways that receptionists often earn trust, remembering birthdays, handling difficult clients with grace, staying late without complaint. One of those partners, a woman named Diane Okafor who specialized in commercial real estate law, had mentioned once, in passing, that her brother ran procurement for a mid-sized regional grocery chain that was drowning in supply chain inefficiencies. Maggie had remembered that detail for 11 months before she finally worked up the nerve to ask Diane for the introduction, terrified of overstepping a relationship she valued, terrified of seeming as though she had only ever been kind to Diane in order to extract something from her later. Why didn't you ask me sooner? Diane had said, laughing, when Maggie finally explained why she wanted the introduction. Of course I'll connect you. That's what people who like each other do, Maggie. You've been worrying about this for months for nothing. That single introduction became Ashworth Dynamics' third paying client, a client that stayed with the company for 6 years and provided the case study Daniel would use, over and over, in every subsequent pitch deck, to demonstrate real-world impact rather than theoretical promise. Daniel never knew, in any detailed way, how much quiet effort had gone into that single connection. 3 years of small kindnesses at a job Maggie had taken purely for the health insurance, culminating in a moment of vulnerability she had needed real courage to push through. He knew only that Maggie's friend from the law firm had introduced him to a good client, a fact he mentioned occasionally at dinner parties in the company's early years as a charming, minor detail of their origin story, before eventually forgetting to mention it at all. She had never corrected the record. She had told herself, at the time, that credit did not matter as much as outcomes, that she loved him and wanted him to succeed and did not need applause for helping that happen. It would take her years to understand that a marriage which only works when one person continually declines credit for their own contributions is not a partnership. It is simply a slower, gentler version of the same arithmetic that had destroyed her cousin Isabel, dressed up in kindness instead of cruelty, but arriving, eventually, at the same quiet erasure. The 48 hours between the first hearing and the reconvened one felt, to Maggie, like standing at the edge of something she had spent 11 years trying to avoid. She spent that time in the small apartment she had rented after leaving the house in Greenwich, a house Daniel had built for them once the company's first major round of funding came through, a house with a kitchen island the size of the entire apartment above the laundromat where they had started. She sat on the floor of her new living room, surrounded by boxes she had not yet unpacked, and let herself remember things she had spent years trying not to think about too closely. She remembered the night investors finally said yes. It had been the 10th pitch. She had gone with him, uninvited by the venture firm but insisted upon by Daniel, who said he could not walk into that room without her there. She had sat in the hallway outside the conference room for 2 hours, and when he came out, pale and shaking, she thought at first that they had been rejected again. Then he grabbed her by both shoulders and told her that Halbrook Ventures had just agreed to invest $6 million, and the two of them had stood in that hallway laughing and crying at the same time, and he had said, with his forehead pressed against hers, "I could not have done a single day of this without you. Not one day." She held on to that sentence for a long time. Longer than she probably should have, because the man who said it was not entirely the same man who, 4 years later, stood in their kitchen and told her, almost offhandedly, while scrolling through his phone, that he thought it might be time she found something to do, now that the company had grown past the point where she could meaningfully contribute. She remembered the specific cruelty of that word, meaningfully, as though the years of proofreading his contracts by lamplight, catching a clause in an early licensing agreement that would have signed away exclusive rights to his own algorithm for a fraction of its value, had been meaningless. As though the nights she had talked him down from panic attacks before board meetings, reminding him he had earned his place at that table, had been meaningless. As though every dinner she had cooked for investors in their cramped apartment kitchen, every network of contacts she had quietly built through her old law firm connections and handed to him without ever taking credit, had all simply evaporated the moment the company became large enough that people stopped needing to be impressed by a home-cooked meal. She had told herself, at the time, that he was just stressed, that success changed people temporarily, and that the man underneath would come back once things settled. He did not come back. Instead, over the following years, he grew more comfortable in a version of himself that no longer needed her advice, no longer asked her opinion before signing anything, no longer introduced her at company events as his wife but as, increasingly, Maggie, with no explanation offered at all, as though she were a distant relative he was obligated to invite. And then, 18 months ago, she had found the messages. She had not been looking for them. She had picked up his second phone, the one he said was strictly for investor communications, to charge it because the battery had died during a call he was expecting. And there, on the lock screen, had been a message from a name she did not recognize. Vivienne. I can't stop thinking about last night. She remembered standing in the kitchen of the Greenwich house, holding that phone, feeling something inside her go very quiet and very still, the way the ocean goes still, right before a larger wave arrives. She had not screamed. She had not thrown anything. She had simply set the phone back down exactly where she found it, walked into the guest bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed for 3 hours, thinking. She thought about her grandfather, who had told her once, when she was 14 years old and furious about something small, that the Hale family did not make decisions in anger. Anger is expensive, he had said. It costs you your clarity, and clarity is the only thing that ever actually wins. She had filed for divorce 4 months later, once she understood the shape of what she was dealing with, once she had quietly, carefully, without a single confrontation, begun preparing for exactly what was now unfolding in Courtroom 4. Because Margaret Hale had learned, a very long time ago, that the people who underestimate you are the ones who eventually hand you the exact leverage you need, and Daniel Ashworth had been underestimating her since the day they met. There was one memory Maggie had not let herself think about since the divorce began, because it was the memory that had hurt the most to reconsider once she understood the whole shape of her marriage. It was the memory of the contract. It had happened during the company's second year, when Ashworth Dynamics was still 4 people working out of a converted warehouse space in Long Island City, when Daniel still asked her opinion before making any decision that mattered. A logistics conglomerate called Belmore Freight had approached him with an offer to license his predictive algorithm exclusively, a deal that, on paper, promised more money than either of them had ever imagined seeing at once. Daniel had been ready to sign it that same week. He had come home practically vibrating with excitement, spreading the contract across their kitchen table, pointing at the number in the payment schedule as though it alone answered every question worth asking. Maggie had read it twice before she said anything. "Daniel," she said carefully, "this clause here, Section 14, it isn't just licensing the algorithm to Belmore. It's assigning them the exclusive right to any derivative technology you develop using this codebase for the next 12 years. If you build anything on top of this later, anything at all, they own a claim to it." He had waved her off at first, certain that a woman who worked reception at a law firm, rather than practicing law herself, could not possibly have caught something his own lawyer had missed. But she had insisted he have an actual intellectual property attorney review Section 14 specifically, and when he finally did, 3 days later, the attorney confirmed exactly what she had seen on her first read. Belmore's offer would have signed away the future of the entire company for an immediate payday that, in hindsight, would have covered perhaps 18 months of their expenses and nothing more. Daniel had renegotiated, narrowing the license to a single, well-compensated but non-exclusive use case, and Ashworth Dynamics had gone on, 2 years later, to build the very derivative technology that would have belonged entirely to Belmore Freight under the original terms. That single derivative product eventually accounted for nearly a third of the company's total valuation. He had thanked her, that week, with more sincerity than she had ever heard from him before or since. He had told her, holding her hands across that same kitchen table, that she had just saved the entire future of the company, that he did not know what he would do without someone who read things as carefully as she did, who cared enough to catch what everyone else missed. 3 years later, in a deposition Maggie would only learn about secondhand, Daniel would describe that same period of the marriage as a time when his wife handled some correspondence for the business. She had not confronted him about the discrepancy when she learned of it. She had simply understood, with a clarity that had cost her something to arrive at, that memory becomes a kind of currency in a marriage, and that some people spend it selectively, keeping the parts that serve the story they need to tell about themselves, and quietly discarding the parts that would require them to share credit. There was a second memory, older than the first, that she thought about just as often, though it belonged not to her marriage but to the years before it, and it explained, more than anything else could, exactly why she had built the wall she built around her own history. Her cousin's name was Isabel. Isabel Hale had been 3 years older than Maggie, the daughter of Charles Hale's eldest son, raised in the same enormous house, and she had married, at 26, a charming, ambitious young architect named Robert Thorne, who had courted her with a persistence that everyone in the family had, at the time, found genuinely moving. Maggie remembered the wedding. She remembered how happy Isabel had looked, how certain she had seemed that she had found someone who loved her for exactly who she was. It had taken less than 2 years for the cracks to show. Robert had discovered, early in the marriage, the true scope of the Hale family's wealth and Isabel's eventual position within it, and something in him had shifted, subtly at first and then unmistakably, from a man building a life alongside his wife to a man managing an investment. He began steering her towards certain financial decisions. He began questioning, gently at first and then less gently, why family assets sat untouched in trusts rather than being deployed toward their future. He began, over time, treating every disagreement as a referendum on how much she truly trusted him, using the language of intimacy to extract access to things that had never been his to access. By the time Isabel finally left him, 6 years later, he had managed to extract nearly $4 million from accounts she controlled directly, money he had convinced her, piece by piece, to release for investments that had mysteriously never materialized. The divorce had been ugly, prolonged, and had left Isabel, by her own later admission to a 19-year-old Maggie, sitting beside her at their grandfather's kitchen table, permanently uncertain of her own judgment, permanently suspicious of anyone who showed her kindness, wondering, for the rest of her adult life, whether any man who ever loved her actually loved her, or simply loved what she represented. "I used to be so sure of myself," Isabel had told her that night, her voice flat in a way that frightened Maggie more than tears would have. "I don't know how to be sure of anything anymore." Maggie had been 22 years old when her grandfather passed away 6 months later, sitting in the front pew of his funeral, and it was that memory of Isabel, more than any legal document, that had shaped the decision she made in the years that followed. She would build a life first. She would let someone fall in love with the version of her that had nothing to offer but herself. And if that love turned out to be real, truly real, then perhaps, eventually, the rest could be revealed safely. It had not turned out to be entirely real, not in the way she had hoped. But it had turned out to be real enough, for long enough, to teach her exactly what she needed to know about herself, about resilience, and about the particular, hard-won difference between a love that disappears the moment it stops being convenient and a sense of self-worth that does not. The 4 months between finding the message on Daniel's second phone and formally filing for divorce were, by Maggie's own later description, the most disciplined period of her entire life. She did not confront him immediately. She understood, with a clarity that surprised even herself in the moment, that confrontation without preparation would simply hand him the advantage of controlling the narrative, of framing whatever came next as a misunderstanding, an argument, a rocky patch to be smoothed over with promises he had broken before and would likely break again. She had watched him do exactly that kind of smoothing over smaller transgressions for years, watched him turn her legitimate concerns into conversations about her own insecurity, and she was not willing to hand him the chance to do it with something this significant. Instead, she made an appointment, under an assumed scheduling name, with Walter Bregman, whom she had met only twice before, at her grandfather's memorial service, and once, briefly, during the initial establishment of the trust when she was 22. "I need to understand exactly what protections exist," she told him, sitting across from his desk in a conference room with a view of the harbor. "If I decide to end my marriage, I need to know what happens to the trust, what happens to its confidentiality, and I need to know it before I take a single step toward filing anything." Bregman had walked her through the clause her grandfather had built, the same clause that would eventually upend an entire courtroom, explaining its mechanics with the careful precision of a man laying out a chess position for a player who had not yet decided whether she wanted to play the game at all. "You understand," he said gently, "that once you file, this becomes public record, potentially. Your grandfather built the confidentiality release, the same clause that would eventually upend an entire courtroom, explaining its mechanics with the careful precision of a man laying out a chess position for a player who had not yet decided whether she wanted to play the game at all. You understand," he said gently, "that once you file, this becomes public record, potentially. Your grandfather built the confidentiality release to be discretionary, meaning you control when and how it surfaces, and you are under no obligation to use it at all if you'd prefer a quieter resolution." "I don't know yet what I'll do with it," Maggie admitted. "I just need to know it exists, and that it's there if I need it." She spent those 4 months living, outwardly, an almost identical version of the life she had been living for years, cooking dinner, managing the household, attending the occasional company function at Daniel's side, all while privately, methodically, building a foundation beneath a decision she had not yet fully made. She opened a separate bank account. She found the small Brooklyn apartment and quietly secured the lease months before she would need it. She began, slowly, reconnecting with people outside her marriage, old friends from the law firm, a cousin she had drifted from, rebuilding a support network she realized, with some discomfort, had atrophied significantly over 11 years of orbiting almost entirely around Daniel's career. She never once considered exercising the trust advisory position as a first resort, or using its existence as a bargaining chip during the marriage itself. That was never who she wanted to be, not toward him, not toward herself. The trust was a shield her grandfather had built for exactly this circumstance, not a weapon to be drawn the moment things became difficult. She would use it only if the alternative was watching herself be erased entirely, in a courtroom, in front of strangers, by a man who had once told her he could not have done a single day of his success without her. It was Daniel himself, ultimately, standing in front of Preston Vance's carefully constructed argument that her contribution to their marriage amounted to nothing, who made the decision for her. She had not wanted to use it, but she had also promised herself, sitting in that hallway outside a conference room 11 years earlier, that she would never again let herself be erased quietly, the way she had watched her cousin Isabel be erased. The moment Daniel's own lawyer said the word nothing, out loud, in a legal record, something in her settled into a decision she had spent 4 careful months preparing for, and had hoped, right up until that final moment, she would never actually need to make. Thursday morning, Courtroom 4 was fuller than it had been on Monday. Word had traveled, the way word always travels in a courthouse. through clerks and paralegals and the particular gossip network that exists among people who spend their working lives watching other people's private disasters unfold in public. There was a rumor that Judge Faust herself had stayed late Tuesday night to examine something. There was a rumor that the Document Authentication Office had called in a specialist. There was a rumor, entirely invented but repeated anyway, that Maggie Hale was somehow connected to organized crime. Because how else could a woman with a library card and a checking account produce something that made a sitting judge cancel her evening plans? Daniel arrived with Vivian on his arm again, though this time he seemed slightly less at ease. He had spent Wednesday making calls, she would later learn, trying to find out through back channels what exactly had been sealed inside that envelope. He had gotten nowhere. Whatever it was, it had not touched any database his people had access to. Maggie arrived alone, as she had before, but this time there was a man waiting for her outside the courtroom doors. An older gentleman in a well-tailored gray suit, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. He greeted her with a small, respectful nod, and the two of them walked in together. "Who is that?" Vivian murmured to Daniel, watching them settle at the defendant's table. "I don't know," Daniel said, though something in his voice suggested he did not like not knowing. Preston Vance leaned over. "That's Walter Bregman," he said quietly, "senior partner at Croft, Bregman and Aldous." Daniel frowned. "I've never heard of them." "You wouldn't have," Vance said, and for the first time, there was something careful in his voice, something that had not been there on Monday. "They don't do public work. They handle estates. Very old estates." Judge Faust entered, and the room settled into silence. "We are back on the record in the matter of Ashworth versus Hale," she said. "Mrs. Hale submitted a sealed document Monday for authentication. That document has been examined, verified, and I am prepared to enter it into evidence." She paused, looking out over the courtroom, and something in her expression made even the gallery lean forward. "Given the nature of what this document contains, I want to be very clear that this proceeding will continue with full decorum. I will not tolerate outbursts." "Your Honor," Vance said, rising, "we would ask to know the nature of the document before it is entered." "You'll know in a moment, Mr. Vance, same as everyone else." She nodded to the clerk. "Mrs. Hale, would you like to introduce your counsel for this portion of the proceeding?" Maggie stood. "Your Honor, this is Mr. Walter Bregman, senior partner at Croft, Bregman and Aldous, who has served as trustee counsel for my family for 11 years. I have retained him for the purpose of presenting this document, though I remain unrepresented in the underlying divorce proceeding by choice." Daniel's head turned sharply toward her. "Your family," he repeated, under his breath, loud enough that Vivian heard it, loud enough that the row behind them heard it. Walter Bregman rose, buttoned his jacket, and approached the podium with the unhurried calm of a man who had spent 4 decades in rooms far more intimidating than this one. "Your Honor," he said, "with the court's permission, I would like to read into the record the contents of the document submitted by my client, Margaret Whitfield Hale." Whitfield. Daniel's face changed at the sound of it, though he could not yet have said why. It was simply a name, unfamiliar and strange, attached to a woman he had believed, for 11 years, he understood completely. "Proceed," Judge Faust said, and the courtroom, which only 3 days earlier had been laughing, went utterly silent. Before Bregman ever opened his portfolio, there had been nearly 20 minutes of procedural sparring that the transcript would later record in dry, clinical language, but that everyone sitting in that courtroom experienced as something closer to watching a storm gather on the horizon, slow and inevitable, and impossible to look away from. "Your Honor," Vance had said, rising almost before the judge finished speaking, "before any document is entered, I would ask this court to require full disclosure of its provenance. We have had less than 48 hours to prepare a response to whatever Mrs. Hale intends to introduce, and my client's rights to due process require—" "Mr. Vance," Judge Faust had said, not unkindly but without patience either, "your client had 11 years to ask his wife basic questions about her own family history. I am not inclined to treat 48 hours as an unreasonable burden by comparison." "Your objection is noted. Proceed, Mr. Bregman." Vance had tried twice more, first questioning whether a document authenticated by the court's own office could be considered impartial, and then, when that failed, attempting to argue that whatever the document contained, it was irrelevant to a marital estate proceeding unless it could be proven the assets had been commingled during the marriage. Bregman had answered each objection with the unhurried patience of a man who had spent 40 years anticipating exactly these arguments and had, in most cases, anticipated Vance's specific version of them before Vance himself had finished forming the thought. Commingling is precisely the wrong framework, counsel, Bregman had said at one point, because we are not here to argue that trust assets became marital property. We are here because a legal instrument, executed years before this marriage began, contains provisions directly triggered by the conduct of this proceeding. Whether the underlying assets were commingled is irrelevant to whether the triggering clause has been satisfied. By the time Judge Faust finally cut off the procedural back and forth and instructed Bregman to proceed with reading the document into evidence, the entire courtroom had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of watching two very different kinds of certainty collide: Vance's confidence built on decades of winning cases through aggression and reputation, and Bregman's built on something quieter and, it was becoming increasingly clear, considerably more solid. Judge Faust, watching both men, allowed herself a small, private thought she would never say aloud in her courtroom. She had seen a great many attorneys walk into her court, believing themselves the smartest person in the room. She had rarely seen one so thoroughly, and so publicly, discover otherwise in real time. "Proceed, Mr. Bregman," she said again, and this time, no one objected. Walter Bregman opened his portfolio and withdrew a set of documents, each page bound with a blue legal ribbon, the kind of formality that belonged to a different era of law entirely. "This document," he said, "is a certified copy of the Charles Whitfield Hale Family Trust, established 22 years ago by the late Charles Whitfield Hale, founder of Hale Maritime Holdings, and grandfather of Margaret Whitfield Hale, the defendant in this proceeding." A murmur moved through the gallery. Judge Faust did not silence it this time. She was watching Daniel Ashworth's face, and she was not the only one. "The trust," Bregman continued, "was established with a corpus of assets that, as of the most recent valuation conducted 6 weeks ago by Ellery and Combs, an independent auditing firm retained by the trustees, stands at approximately $5.1 billion. The word landed in the room like a physical object. Someone in the back row actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound, the kind of laugh a person makes when they think they have misheard something. Vivienne Cole's hand, which had been resting on Daniel's forearm, went still. "5 billion, Vance repeated, and for the first time in 3 days, his voice had lost every trace of its practiced condescension. "Point 1, Bregman said mildly. "The trust includes a controlling interest in Hale Maritime Holdings, substantial commercial real estate across 4 states, a diversified investment portfolio managed by Sterling Crane Asset Management, and minority stakes in 11 private companies, one of which," he paused, glancing briefly, almost apologetically, to Judge Faust raised a hand slightly. "Mr. Bregman, before you continue, I want the record to reflect precisely why this document was sealed, and why it is only surfacing now." "Of course, Your Honor." Bregman turned a page. "The trust was structured by Charles Hale with a specific and, I will say, unusual clause, inserted at his explicit instruction 18 months before his death. The clause states that Margaret Hale, as primary beneficiary, would not be granted access to, control over, or public disclosure of the trust's existence during any period in which she was legally married, unless she herself initiated that disclosure. Mr. Hale believed, having watched his own granddaughter's cousins suffer the consequences of a marriage built around inherited wealth, that his granddaughter deserved the chance to build a life, and a marriage, entirely on her own terms, without her worth being measured against a number. He looked up. The clause further specifies that upon the filing of divorce proceedings by either party, the trust's confidentiality restriction is automatically lifted, at Mrs. Hale's discretion, to be used in whatever manner she deems appropriate, including as evidence in the very proceeding that triggered its release. Maggie sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching Daniel's face with an expression that held no triumph. Only a strange, quiet sadness, the particular grief of finally seeing someone as clearly as she had always suspected she eventually would. "Your Honor," Vance said, standing, his voice noticeably less steady than it had been on Monday. This changes the entire financial posture of this case. If Mrs. Hale has been sitting on assets of this magnitude throughout the marriage, she was not sitting on anything, Mr. Vance," Bregman said, cutting in with the calm precision of a man who had anticipated the objection before it was finished forming. "She had no access to it, no knowledge of its current valuation, no control over its assets. She could not have used it, borrowed against it, or disclosed it, even if she had wished to, without violating the terms her grandfather set specifically to protect her from precisely the situation this court is currently witnessing. Judge Faust looked out at the gallery, at Daniel, at Vivian, at the reporters who had begun scribbling furiously in notebooks and thumbing out messages on their phones beneath the table where they thought she could not see. "Mr. Bregman," she said, "you mentioned this trust holds a minority stake in a private company relevant to Mr. Ashworth. I believe now is the appropriate time to address that." Bregman nodded and turned to the next page in his portfolio. Daniel Ashworth, who had walked into this courtroom on Monday laughing, sat very still, watching the lawyer's hands, as though he already understood, somewhere beneath the shock, that whatever came next was going to cost him considerably more than $200,000. 11 years ago, Bregman said, a young entrepreneur named Daniel Ashworth received a $6 million seed investment from Halbrook Ventures, a firm that, at the time, had never invested in an unproven founder with no prior track record and no collateral of his own. Daniel's jaw tightened. What Mr. Ashworth did not know, Bregman continued, was that Halbrook Ventures had recently suffered significant losses in an unrelated fund and was, at that time, unwilling to take on a founder as unproven as Mr. Ashworth without some form of risk mitigation. The trust, through a private arrangement negotiated by the late Charles Hale's estate managers, provided a limited guarantee to Halbrook Ventures covering 40% of that initial investment, structured as a silent minority position, in exchange for a small equity stake and a seat on an advisory board that never once, in 11 years, exercised its voting rights or made its presence known to Mr. Ashworth directly. "Why," Daniel said, finally speaking for the first time in several minutes, his voice hoarse, "why would they do that? Why would anyone guarantee an investment in a company they'd never even—" He stopped. He looked at Maggie. Bregman answered anyway. "Because the late Mr. Hale's estate managers were, at the time, in the process of vetting founders for a discrete impact initiative aimed at supporting promising entrepreneurs who lacked traditional access to venture capital. Mr. Ashworth's application, submitted independently through Halbrook, was one of several considered. He was selected on the merits of his technology alone. Mrs. Hale had no knowledge of this arrangement at the time it was made. She did not meet Mr. Ashworth until 8 months after the guarantee was already in place." A flicker of something like relief crossed Daniel's face, and then, immediately, something worse replaced it, as the rest of the implication settled in. "But the point," Bregman said, closing his portfolio, "is this. Ashworth Dynamics exists, in its current form, because of a financial guarantee originating from the Hale Family Trust. That guarantee is documented, structured, and, per its original terms, includes a clause allowing the trust to call in its position, convert its silent stake into an active one, and exercise full voting rights on the advisory board under specific triggering conditions." "What conditions?" Vance asked quietly. Bregman looked at him with something that was almost, but not quite, sympathy. "Divorce proceedings initiated against the trust's primary beneficiary by her spouse," he said, "in which said spouse is a controlling officer of the company in question, and in which said spouse's legal counsel has, on the record, characterized the beneficiary's contributions to that company as, and I am quoting directly from Monday's transcript, nothing." The silence that followed was the loudest silence Courtroom 4 had experienced in its entire history. Daniel Ashworth put both hands flat on the table in front of him, as though he needed something solid to hold on to. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the trust can take control of my company." "I am telling you," Bregman said, "that the trust already holds the contractual right to convert its position, effective immediately upon these proceedings, into a controlling advisory role with binding vote on any matter concerning executive leadership, capital structure, or merger and acquisition activity. Whether Mrs. Hale chooses to exercise that right is, of course, entirely up to her." Every eye in the courtroom turned to Maggie. She sat very still for a long moment, looking not at Daniel, and not at the reporters, and not at the judge, but down at her own folded hands, the same hands that had once typed his pitch decks at 2 a.m, the same hands that had once believed, completely and without reservation, that the man across the room loved her. "Your Honor," she said finally, her voice quiet but perfectly clear, "I would like a brief recess before I answer that question." Judge Faust studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "Granted," she said. 15 minutes. She struck the gavel, and the courtroom erupted into a wall of noise. Reporters standing, phones lifting, Preston Vance already halfway out of his chair reaching for Daniel's arm, and through all of it, Maggie Hale rose from the defendant's table and walked, unhurried, toward the doors, exactly as she had on Monday. Only this time, no one in that courtroom was laughing. Judge Eleanor Faust had sat on the bench for 28 years, and in that time, she had developed a private habit that no attorney who ever appeared before her fully understood. She watched hands. Faces could be trained, voices could be rehearsed, but hands, she had found, over decades of watching people testify under pressure, rarely learned to lie as convincingly as the rest of the body did. She had watched Daniel Ashworth's hands throughout the entire proceeding, watched them rest with easily as she had on Monday. Only this time, no one in that courtroom was laughing. Judge Eleanor Faust had sat on the bench for 28 years, and in that time, she had developed a private habit that no attorney who ever appeared before her fully understood. She watched hands. Faces could be trained, voices could be rehearsed, but hands, she had found, over decades of watching people testify under pressure, rarely learned to lie as convincingly as the rest of the body did. She had watched Daniel Ashworth's hands throughout the entire proceeding, watched them rest with easy confidence on the table Monday morning, watched them tighten almost imperceptibly the moment Bregman said the word Whitfield, watched them, now, pressed flat against the table as though the wood itself might steady something that had come loose inside him. She had also watched Margaret Hale's hands, and what she had noticed, more than anything else, was how still they had remained since the very first moment of the proceeding, folded and quiet, even while an entire courtroom laughed at her, even while opposing counsel called her contribution to her own marriage nothing, even now, in the wake of a revelation that had just upended every assumption a room full of strangers had made about her within the first 90 seconds of meeting her. It was that stillness, more than the trust, more than the $5 billion, more than the extraordinary legal architecture Charles Hale had built to protect his granddaughter from exactly this circumstance, that Judge Faust found herself thinking about as she called the recess. In 28 years, she had seen wealth destroy people's composure in both directions. The newly rich who could not stop performing their good fortune, and the newly wronged who could not stop performing their grievance. She had rarely seen someone hold that particular kind of stillness under both kinds of pressure at once. She made a private note to herself, one that would never appear in any transcript, that whatever Margaret Hale decided to do with the power that had just been placed, publicly and irreversibly, into her hands, it would likely say more about the woman's character than any legal document ever could. She was not wrong. The recess did not stay contained to 15 quiet minutes. Within 5, Daniel was in the hallway outside courtroom 4 with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent, talking to his chief financial officer, who had apparently already heard, because news like this did not wait for official channels. It moved through boardrooms and group chats and encrypted messaging threads faster than any court reporter could type. "I need you to tell me this isn't as bad as it sounds," Daniel said into the phone, pacing a tight line along the marble floor. Whatever his CFO said in response made him stop walking entirely. "A controlling advisory position," Daniel repeated, his voice dropping. "With binding votes on leadership and M&A. A pause. So if she exercises it, she could vote to remove me." Another pause, longer this time. "I understand it's unlikely," he said. "I understand it's not automatic. I understand all of that. But I need you to understand that unlikely is not the same as impossible. And our Series D closes in 6 weeks, and if word gets out that there's an unresolved ownership dispute tied to a family trust with $5 billion behind it, our valuation is going to—" He stopped talking. He had noticed Vivienne standing a few feet away, watching him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not mockery, not amusement, calculation. "I need to call you back," he said into the phone, and hung up. "Vivienne," he started. "You told me she had nothing," Vivienne said. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something cold working its way to the surface. "You told me she came from nothing. You told me the only reason she stayed married to you as long as she did was because she had nowhere else to go." "I didn't know," Daniel said. "Vivienne, I swear to you, I had no idea." "You didn't know your own wife came from a $5 billion family," Vivienne said, and the laugh that came out of her this time held no delight in it at all. "For 11 years. She hid it from me." "Did she?" Vivian said, tilting her head slightly, studying him the way a person studies a stranger for the first time. Or did you simply never once, in 11 years, ask her a single question about herself that wasn't about what she could do for you? Daniel opened his mouth and closed it again. Vivian straightened her coat, the champagne-colored one that had, 3 days ago, felt like a costume of victory, and now felt, suddenly, like a very expensive mistake. I think, she said, I'm going to go home, Daniel. Vivian, I backed a horse I thought was the strongest one in the race, she said. I didn't realize I was betting against the woman who was quietly funding the track. She turned and walked away without looking back, her heels striking the marble floor in a sharp, retreating rhythm, and Daniel Ashworth stood alone in the hallway of a courthouse, watching the second woman in his life walk out of it in under a week, though this one, at least, had the decency to be honest about why. 3 floors above Courtroom 4, in a conference room at Ashworth Dynamics's downtown offices, 6 board members sat around a video call screen, watching a live stream of legal commentary from a financial news channel that had, within the hour, begun covering the case as breaking business news rather than a private domestic matter. How did none of us know about this? Said Rachel Kim, the board's longest-serving independent director, a woman who had joined 3 years into the company's life and had grown accustomed, in that time, to very little surprising her. How does a $5 billion family trust exist in complete silence for 11 years? Because it was designed to, said Marcus Webb, the company's general counsel, who had spent the last 90 minutes on the phone with 3 different outside law firms, trying to understand exactly how exposed the company actually was. Bregman's firm doesn't do public work. If the trust's own beneficiary didn't know its current valuation, there's no reason anyone at Ashworth would have. What's our exposure? Rachel asked. Real numbers, Marcus, not reassurance. Marcus exhaled. If she exercises the advisory position, worst case, she gains binding votes on executive leadership and major transactions. That doesn't mean she removes Daniel immediately. It means she has the legal standing to force the issue, and every future investor doing diligence on this company will see that standing sitting on our cap table like a loaded gun on a table nobody's allowed to touch. And best case, she declines to exercise it. We spend the next 18 months rebuilding investor confidence through governance reform, and we treat this as the closest call in company history rather than the event that ended it. Rachel was quiet for a moment, watching the muted livestream, watching a reporter's mouth move soundlessly beneath a chyron that read, "Billionaire founder's divorce reveals hidden family fortune." I want it on record, she said finally, that if she does decline, this board implements every governance reform I've been requesting for the last 2 years, without further debate. We got lucky today. I don't want to find out what happens the next time we're not. No one on the call disagreed with her, which was, itself, a small but significant sign of exactly how thoroughly the last 3 hours had reshaped the company's internal politics. Down the hall, in a small witness room the clerk had offered her for privacy, Maggie sat alone with a paper cup of water she had not touched. She was thinking about her grandfather. She was 14 years old the last time she had truly lost her temper in front of him, furious about some small unfairness she could no longer even remember the details of, and he had knelt down in front of her, an old man in a house full of staff, who nonetheless always found time to kneel down to a child's eye level, and told her something she had carried with her every day since. Power, he had said, is not the ability to hurt someone who has hurt you. Any fool can do that. Power is the ability to hurt them, to have every right to hurt them, and to choose something better instead. That choice is the only kind of power that actually lasts. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. She thought about the 14 months she had spent helping Daniel manage correspondence for a company that would one day be worth $400 million. Work he had once called invaluable and later called nothing at all. She thought about the nights she had stayed up rehearsing pitch decks with him, catching contract clauses that would have cost him everything, believing in him before a single investor did. She thought about the phone on the kitchen counter in Greenwich, and the message that had ended everything she thought she understood about her own life. And she thought about the choice in front of her now. She could exercise the trust's advisory position. She could, with a single signature, insert herself into the leadership of the company Daniel had built, could vote, could influence, could very likely force him out entirely if she chose to pursue it with the full weight of Bregman's legal team behind her. It would be, by any reasonable measure, justice. It would also make her exactly the kind of person her grandfather had spent his final years trying to protect her from becoming. There was a knock at the door. Walter Bregman stepped inside, closing it quietly behind him. "The 15 minutes are nearly up," he said gently. "Whatever you decide, Margaret, I want you to know the trust will support it. Your grandfather structured that clause for exactly this circumstance. He wanted you to have the power. What you do with it was always meant to be entirely your choice." Maggie looked up at him. "I know what I'm going to say," she said. And for the first time in 3 days, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Not triumphant, not cruel, simply certain. When the courtroom reconvened, it was fuller still. Word had spread beyond the courthouse now, out into the world, in the particular way that only certain kinds of stories can spread. Stories with billionaires and secrets, and a woman nobody had bothered to notice until it was too late to unsee her. Vivian Cole's seat behind the plaintiff's table was empty. Daniel sat alone now, without his lawyer's easy confidence beside him, without the mistress whose presence had once felt like a weapon aimed at his wife, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had built an empire on someone else's quiet sacrifice and had never once thought to ask what that sacrifice had cost her, or what she might still be capable of. "We are back on the record," Judge Faust said. "Mrs. Hale, you had asked for time to consider your position regarding the trust's advisory rights over Ashworth Dynamics. The court is prepared to hear your decision." Maggie stood. She did not look at notes, because she had brought none. She did not look at Bregman, though he sat ready beside her, prepared to speak on her behalf if she asked him to. She looked, instead, directly at Daniel, and for a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath along with him. "Your Honor," she said, "I decline to exercise the trust's advisory position over Ashworth Dynamics." A murmur swept the gallery. Preston Vance, who had been visibly bracing for the opposite, allowed a small, involuntary breath of relief to escape him. "I want to be clear about why," Maggie continued, "because I don't want this decision mistaken for weakness, or for forgiveness, or for anything resembling reconciliation. I am not choosing mercy because Daniel deserves it. I am choosing it because my grandfather built this trust to protect me from becoming someone who uses power the way it was used against her. If I take his company from him out of anger, I become exactly the kind of person this trust was designed to keep me from becoming. I would rather walk out of this courtroom with my name intact than with his company attached to it." She turned back to the judge. "What I do ask," she said, "is that the court recognize, as a matter of record and settlement, the true nature and value of my contributions to this marriage, and to the early years of Ashworth Dynamics, contributions that opposing counsel described 3 days ago as, quote, nothing. I am not asking for equity in the company. I am asking for what is fair under the law, calculated honestly, without the assumption that a woman's labor in a marriage is worth less because it did not come with a job title." Judge Faust looked at her for a long moment, and something in the older woman's expression, careful and unreadable for 3 days, finally softened into something that looked almost like respect. "Mr. Vance," she said, turning to the plaintiff's table, "does your client wish to respond?" Vance glanced sideways at Daniel, who had not spoken, who was staring at Maggie with an expression that had shifted, over the last hour, through shock and fear, and something that now, unmistakably, resembled grief. "Your Honor," Daniel said, standing before Vance could answer for him, his voice unsteady in a way it had never been in 11 years of watching him command boardrooms. "May I address the court directly?" "You may," Judge Faust said. Daniel turned toward Maggie. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to stand here in front of everyone and say what I actually feel, because I spent so many years learning how to sound certain about things that I forgot how to sound honest." He stopped, swallowed, continued. "I called your work nothing. I said it in a deposition, in front of a room full of people, because I had convinced myself, somewhere along the way, that the only kind of contribution that counted was the kind that showed up on a balance sheet. I was wrong. I think I've been wrong for a long time, and I think some part of me knew it and didn't want to look at it too closely, because looking at it meant admitting how much I owed you, and I didn't know how to owe someone that much and still feel like I'd earned any of it myself." The courtroom was utterly silent. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I don't think I've earned that, and after today, I understand I probably never fully will. But I want it on the record, in front of this court, that everything Mr. Vance said on Monday was a lie I paid him to tell, and I let him tell it because it was easier than admitting the truth. You didn't contribute nothing to this marriage, or to this company. You contributed nearly everything that mattered, and I was too afraid of what that meant about my own worth to ever say it out loud. Maggie listened to all of it without moving, without her expression changing. The same stillness she had held since Monday morning. The stillness that had once been mistaken, by an entire courtroom, for weakness. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "I mean that. But Daniel, I need you to understand something, because I don't think you do yet, even now." She paused. "I'm not standing here because I want an apology. I stopped needing anything from you the day I found that message on your phone. I'm standing here because I spent 14 years of my life believing that love meant disappearing quietly into someone else's success, and I am done disappearing. This isn't about you anymore. It hasn't been about you since I opened that envelope's twin, alone, in an apartment, and decided I was finally going to stop being invisible." She looked once more at Judge Faust. "Your Honor, I'm ready to proceed with settlement." The gallery did not immediately empty when Judge Faust called the working recess to move settlement talks into private chambers. Instead, for several long minutes, the room simply sat in a kind of stunned residue, the particular silence that follows an event too large for anyone present to fully process in real time. A woman in the third row, the same woman who had laughed loudest on Monday at Maggie's worn cardigan and her empty defendant's table, found herself, unexpectedly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. She would later tell a colleague she could not explain why the confession had moved her so deeply, except to say that she had spent her own marriage feeling faintly, persistently unseen, in exactly the way Daniel had just described, feeling too afraid to see, and something about hearing a powerful man admit it, publicly, without excuse, had cracked something open in her she had not expected. Two reporters near the back had already stopped typing entirely, simply watching, because some moments, they both understood instinctively, were not meant to be reduced immediately to a headline. Preston Vance sat very still at the now empty plaintiff's table, staring at the space where his client had been sitting, turning something over in his mind that had nothing to do with legal strategy. He had built a 22-year career on the belief that courtrooms were theaters where the sharpest performance won, where confidence was a weapon and vulnerability was a liability to be minimized at all costs. He had just watched a man dismantle that entire theory in 90 seconds, admitting fault without qualification, without a single hedge, and the room had responded not with the contempt Vance would have predicted, but with something that looked remarkably like respect. He did not know, yet, what to do with that information. He suspected it would take him considerably longer than the length of this case to fully understand it. Somewhere in a hallway 3 blocks from the courthouse, Vivian Cole sat in the back seat of a car service she had called the moment she left the building, her phone buzzing with messages she had no intention of answering yet. She was not thinking about Daniel. She was thinking, instead, about a version of herself from 6 years earlier, a young woman fresh out of a fashion marketing program, arriving in New York with almost nothing, determined never again to feel the particular vulnerability of not having money, of watching doors close because she did not have the right last name attached to hers. She had built a life, since then, out of careful calculation, choosing rooms and relationships with the precision of someone assembling armor piece by piece. Watching Maggie Hale decline to take Daniel's company, choosing something that looked almost embarrassingly like mercy when she could have taken everything, had unsettled Vivian more than she wanted to admit. It did not fit the framework she had spent 6 years building her entire adult identity around, the framework that said power, once acquired, should always be used, that mercy was simply a weaker person's excuse for failing to seize an advantage. She did not yet have the language for what she had actually witnessed, which was not weakness at all, but a different, quieter kind of strength than the one she had spent her whole career training herself to recognize. It would take her, by her own later account, nearly 2 years to fully understand it. 2 years that included the end of 2 more relationships built on exactly the calculations to understand it. 2 years that included the end of 2 more relationships built on exactly the calculations she had once believed were the only ones worth making, before she finally, slowly, began building something different for herself, something considerably less glamorous, and considerably more her own. The settlement negotiations that followed took the better part of 2 hours, though very little of it happened in open court. Judge Faust called a working recess, sending both parties, along with Bregman and a visibly shaken Preston Vance, into a private conference room to hammer out terms before she would finalize anything on the record. Maggie sat at the head of the table, Bregman beside her, and laid out her position with the same calm precision she had shown all week. "I am not seeking punitive damages," she said. "I am not seeking equity in Ashworth Dynamics. I am seeking a fair division of marital assets accumulated during the marriage, calculated using standard equitable distribution principles, along with recognition, in the settlement language itself, that my early contributions to the company's founding period constituted material support, not domestic incidental labor." Vance, who had spent 3 days trying to erase the very existence of that labor, now found himself in the strange position of negotiating its value upward, because his client, sitting beside him with his head in his hands, had stopped listening to legal strategy and started simply telling the truth every time he opened his mouth. "$12 million, Daniel said abruptly, lifting his head. "Give her $12 million and the house in Greenwich outright. No further disputes. No ongoing claims against the company." Vance stared at him. "Daniel, we have not even begun to discuss." "I said $12 million, Daniel repeated. "And I want it on the record that I am the one offering it, not the one being forced into it. That matters to me. I don't know why exactly, but it matters." Bregman glanced at Maggie, who considered this for a long moment. $10 million, she said. "And the house goes to a charitable trust in my grandfather's name, not to me. I don't want to live in it. I never did. It was always your house, Daniel, not ours, even when I lived in it. Give the proceeds to something that will outlast both of us." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine understanding crossed his face. $10 million, he said quietly. "Done." "There's one more thing," Maggie said. Vance straightened, visibly bracing for another number, another concession, another line item that would need to be negotiated down. Daniel simply waited, watching her with an attentiveness she had not seen from him in years. "I want a clause added to the settlement agreement," she said, stating explicitly that the characterization of my contributions as, quote, "nothing," made during Monday's proceeding, is formally and permanently withdrawn from the record, replaced with language acknowledging material, documented support during the company's founding period. I don't need Daniel's company. I don't need his money beyond what's fair. But I am not leaving this negotiation without the truth being written down somewhere permanent, in language a court will recognize, because I spent 11 years watching that truth get quietly erased in private, and I refuse to let it happen one final time in public. Bregman glanced at her with something that looked almost like pride, though he said nothing, letting the moment belong entirely to her. Daniel nodded before Vance could formulate an objection. "Agreed," he said. "I'll sign that myself, Preston. Draft the language however she wants it. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life pretending Monday's version of events was ever true." Vance, for the first time in 22 years of practicing family law, found himself with genuinely nothing to say. He simply opened his laptop and began drafting the amendment, while across the table, the two people whose marriage this had once been sat in a silence that was, for the first time in the entire proceeding, no longer adversarial. It was simply tired and honest, and finally, mercifully, close to finished. Bregman used the pause to step into the hallway and call the trust's document office, confirming that no further filings would be necessary before the amendment could be entered. When he returned, he found Maggie standing near the window, looking out at the courthouse steps below, where a small cluster of reporters had already begun to gather, in anticipation of whatever came out of that room next. "You didn't have to add that clause," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "The financial terms alone would have been considered generous by any measure." "I know," Maggie said. "But money was never actually the thing I was fighting for in there, Walter. It never really is, not for most people who end up in rooms like this one. It's the story. Whoever controls the story of a marriage after it ends gets to decide what the years inside it were worth. I wasn't going to let Monday's version be the one that survived." Bregman nodded slowly. "Your grandfather would have understood that better than almost anyone," he said. "He used to tell me the same thing about the companies he acquired over the years. He said the balance sheet only ever tells you what something costs. It never tells you what it's actually worth." He said the second question was always the harder one, and the more important one. Maggie allowed herself a small, tired smile. "He was right about most things," she said. I only wish it hadn't taken me quite this long to fully believe him. It was, by any measure, a fraction of what she could have taken. It was, by any measure, more money than either of them had imagined existing in that apartment above the laundromat 11 years earlier. Both things were true at once, the way most things involving large sums of money and long marriages tend to be. Back in open court, Judge Faust read the settlement terms into the record with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had watched a great many marriages end and had rarely seen one end quite like this. The court finds, she said, that the terms agreed upon by both parties are fair, equitable, and entered into freely and knowingly. This court further wishes to note, for the record, something outside the standard language of dissolution, because in 28 years on this bench, I have rarely witnessed a case that so thoroughly reversed my own assumptions over the course of a single week. She looked directly at the gallery, at the reporters, at everyone who had laughed on Monday. This court began this proceeding with a courtroom full of people who believed they understood exactly who deserved sympathy and who deserved judgment, based on nothing more than the clothes people wore and the confidence with which their lawyers spoke. I would ask everyone leaving this room today to sit with that discomfort for a while. It is a useful one. She struck the gavel. This marriage is dissolved. Court is adjourned. The gallery did not laugh this time. Several people, Maggie noticed as she gathered the empty folder from the defendant's table for the last time, would not quite meet her eyes on the way out. The particular shame of people remembering exactly what they had found funny 3 days earlier. Preston Vance approached her before she left, extending a hand she had not expected. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I owe you an apology. I'm not sure I know how to give properly. I built a career on believing that the person with more money in the room was, by definition, in the right. You reminded me that isn't true, and I don't imagine I'll forget it." She shook his hand. "I hope you don't," she said, and meant it, without cruelty. Daniel lingered near the plaintiff's table, watching her walk toward the doors one final time, the same unhurried walk that had once been mistaken for a woman, with nowhere important to be. "Maggie," he called out. She stopped, turned. "For what it's worth," he said, "I did love you. Somewhere in there, underneath everything I got wrong, I want you to know that's true, even if I understand now it wasn't enough." She looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, there was no bitterness in her voice, only a kind of clear, settled honesty that had taken her 14 years and one very expensive lesson to earn. "I believe you," she said. "I loved you too, Daniel. That was never the problem. The problem was that you loved the version of me who made herself smaller so you could feel larger. That woman doesn't exist anymore. I'm not sure she ever should have." She walked out of courtroom 4 for the last time and did not look back. The story broke publicly within 48 hours, though not because Maggie sought the attention. A junior reporter who had been sitting in the back row of the gallery on Thursday, initially there to cover an unrelated case, had recognized the shape of something larger unfolding in front of her and filed a piece by that evening titled, simply, "The Woman Everyone Underestimated." By the following week, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets, each version slightly more sensational than the last, each one reducing 11 years of a complicated, human marriage into a headline about billions of dollars and a courtroom gasp. Maggie declined every interview request. She had spent her whole life avoiding exactly this kind of attention, and she was not interested in trading one kind of invisibility for another kind of exposure, however flattering the framing. Ashworth Dynamics, meanwhile, spent the following months in a quiet, controlled panic that never technically became public, though anyone paying close attention to the company's sudden and uncharacteristic caution could have guessed something had shifted. The board, made aware of just how close the company had come to an involuntary leadership challenge, insisted on a series of governance reforms that Daniel had resisted for years and now, chastened, accepted without argument. New independent directors were added. A formal ethics review process was implemented. The Series D round closed on schedule, though at a valuation 12% lower than projected, a number Daniel absorbed without complaint, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that it was a modest price for a lesson that could easily have cost him everything. He did not remarry quickly. He did not, as far as anyone close to the situation could tell, pursue anything serious again for nearly 2 years, spending that time instead in a kind of quiet, unglamorous rebuilding that had little to do with corporate strategy and a great deal to do with the private work of understanding how a person becomes the kind of man who calls someone else's 14 years of devotion nothing in a legal filing, and what it would take to become someone who never made that mistake again. He sent Maggie a letter, 8 months after the divorce, not asking for anything, simply thanking her, again, for the mercy she had shown in that conference room. Mercy he understood, now he had not been entitled to, and had received anyway. She read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer she did not open again. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something closer to closure, the particular peace that comes not from an apology being sufficient, but from no longer needing it to be. Maggie did not spend her $10 million the way anyone who had watched her walk into that courtroom in a worn gray cardigan might have expected. She kept the small apartment above what used to be a print shop in Brooklyn, the one she had moved into during the divorce, because she found she liked it there, liked the particular ordinary rhythm of a life not built around anyone else's ambitions. She donated a significant portion of the settlement to a scholarship fund established in her grandfather's name, one specifically designed to support young women entering fields, law, finance, engineering, where they were statistically likely to be underestimated exactly as she once had been. She also, 6 months after the divorce was finalized, did something that surprised even Walter Bregman. She asked him to help her establish a small, quiet fund, separate from the family trust, aimed specifically at first-time entrepreneurs who had been rejected by traditional investors 9 or more times, the exact number Daniel had faced before Halbrook Ventures finally said yes. She called it, simply, the Ninth Door Fund. A private joke only she fully understood, a nod to the specific, brutal arithmetic of persistence that she had watched up close for years, sitting in a hallway outside conference rooms, believing in someone before the world agreed to. The first entrepreneur the fund backed was a 24-year-old former nurse named Priya Anand, who had built a diagnostic software tool that had been turned down by investors 7 times because, as one rejection letter had bluntly put it, healthcare founders without engineering backgrounds present execution risk we are not prepared to underwrite. Maggie read Priya's pitch deck on a Tuesday evening in her small Brooklyn apartment, recognized in it the exact shape of her own younger years spent believing in someone the world had not yet learned to see, and wrote the first check herself, before the fund's formal committee had even finished its review. "Why me?" Priya asked her, during their first meeting, unable to fully understand why a woman with no engineering background of her own had looked at 7 rejections and decided to say yes anyway. "Because someone once believed in an idea nobody else would fund," Maggie told her, "and it changed the entire trajectory of my life, for better and eventually for worse. I'd like to be that person for someone whose story turns out better than mine did. I think it's still possible. I think it might even be likely, if enough people decide to be the person who says yes." Isabel called her 3 weeks after the story broke. They had not spoken often in recent years, not out of any falling out, but simply the ordinary drift of cousins who had once been close as children and had, over time, built separate lives in separate cities. Maggie recognized the number anyway, some part of her having never quite deleted it, and answered on the second ring. "I saw the news," Isabel said, without preamble, her voice carrying an emotion Maggie could not immediately place. "I've read 6 different articles about you this week, and every single one of them got it wrong." "They usually do," Maggie said. "They keep calling it a revenge story," Isabel said. "A billionaire's wife gets even." "That's not what I saw, Maggie. I watched the clip of you declining to take his company, and I sat in my kitchen and cried for 20 minutes. And I don't think I could have told you exactly why until just now, saying it out loud to you." "Why?" Maggie asked gently. "Because you did the thing I never got the chance to do," Isabel said. "You had every reason, every legal right, every ounce of justified anger, to burn it all down, and you chose not to, not because you were weak, not because you still loved him, but because you'd already decided who you wanted to be before you ever walked into that courtroom. I never got that chance. Robert took so much from me before I even understood what was happening that by the time I finally left, all I had left was anger. I didn't get to choose grace. I only had rage, because that's all that was left." Maggie sat with that for a long moment, thinking of a 19-year-old version of herself, sitting beside a 17-year-old version of Isabel, listening to a woman explain that she no longer knew how to trust her own judgment. "You were a warning I needed," Maggie said quietly. "I want you to know that everything I did in that courtroom, I did partly because I spent years afraid of becoming exactly what happened to you. You didn't fail, Isabel. You survived something that was built to break you, and you're still here. That's not nothing. That's actually the hardest part. There was a long silence on the line, the particular silence of two women who had both, in very different ways, spent years learning the same difficult lesson about love and money, and the particular vulnerability of being someone worth more than you let on. "I'm proud of you," Isabel said finally. "I don't think I've said that to anyone in a long time and meant it the way I mean it right now." "Come visit," Maggie said. "I'll cook. Nothing expensive, just us." "I'd like that," Isabel said, and for the first time in the conversation, she sounded unmistakably like she meant it. Priya Anand's diagnostic software company closed its first institutional funding round 11 months after the Ninth Door Fund's initial check. A round led by a mainstream healthcare venture firm that, 18 months earlier, would not have returned Priya's emails. She called Maggie the night the round closed, and Maggie could hear, even through the phone, the particular disbelief of someone who had spent years being told no, finally holding a yes she had almost stopped believing would come. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me it's a mistake," Priya admitted. "That the paperwork got mixed up. That they meant to email someone else." "I know that feeling," Maggie said. "It takes longer to leave than you'd think, even after the yes actually happens." "How long did it take you?" Maggie considered the question honestly. "I'm not sure it's fully gone," she said. "I don't think it has to be, though. I think you can carry the memory of every no you survived and still trust the yes when it finally arrives. Those two things aren't in conflict. If anything, I think the no's are what make you appreciate the yes properly, instead of taking it for granted the way people who've never been told no tend to." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it?" "Not taking the company. Everyone always focuses on the money you did take, but I think about the version of you that could have owned a Earth Dynamics outright, could have had a seat on that board for the rest of your life, could have had that kind of ongoing power. Do you ever wish you'd taken it?" Maggie thought about the question longer than she expected to. "No," she said finally, "because that power would have tied me to him forever, in some form, even after the marriage ended. Every board meeting, every strategic decision, every headline about that company for the rest of my life would have had his name attached to it, and mine attached to his by extension. I didn't want to spend the next 30 years being defined by what I chose not to forgive. I wanted to spend them building something that was entirely, completely mine. The Ninth Door Fund is worth infinitely more to me than a board seat at his company ever could have been, because nobody gave it to me as a consolation prize. I built it myself, out of the wreckage, exactly the way my grandfather built everything he ever built." "That's the answer I was hoping you'd give," Priya said quietly. "I think that's the answer I needed to hear too." Daniel Ashworth began volunteering, roughly a year and a half after the divorce, with a mentorship program for first-generation founders, a decision that surprised several people who had known him only through the version of himself that had existed inside Courtroom 4. He did not speak publicly about the divorce during these sessions, did not use his own cautionary story as a teaching tool, though the shape of it inevitably informed the advice he gave. He found himself, more than once, sitting across from an ambitious young founder, eager to talk exclusively about valuation and growth metrics, gently steering the conversation, instead toward a question he wished someone had asked him, years earlier, before he had built an entire identity around never needing anyone's help. "Who's actually building this with you?" he would ask. "Not investing, not advising, actually building it, in the unglamorous hours nobody writes articles about. Have you told that person, recently and specifically, exactly what their contribution is worth to you? Not generally, specifically. Because I promise you, the day you stop being specific about that is the day you start losing something you won't be able to get back." It was, several of the program's coordinators noted privately, unusually thoughtful advice for a man widely known, at least in certain circles, for a very public and very expensive lesson, in exactly the opposite. He never remarried. He did, eventually, build something that resembled a genuinely equal partnership, years later, with a woman who knew about his past from the very beginning, who had read the articles before she ever agreed to a first date, and who told him, early on, that she was willing to build something with him only if he could prove, over time, through consistent and specific action, that he had actually learned the lesson rather than simply survived its consequences. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove exactly that, one specific, unglamorous day at a time. A year after the divorce, Maggie Hale stood at the edge of a small stage in a community center in Queens, not far from the neighborhood where she and Daniel had once shared a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, delivering the keynote remarks at the first annual Ninth Door Fund Showcase, an event she had insisted remained small, unglamorous, and entirely focused on the founders rather than on her. She wore, that evening, a simple navy dress, nothing that announced wealth, nothing that performed humility either, simply the clothing of a woman who had stopped needing either impression to feel like herself. 11 years ago, she told the small crowd, I sat in a hallway outside a conference room, waiting to find out whether a man I loved was about to be told no for the 10th time. I did not know then that I would spend the next decade of my life learning exactly what it costs a person to disappear quietly into someone else's ambition, and exactly what it takes to stop. She looked out at the room, at Priya Anand sitting in the front row, at a dozen other founders whose ideas the fund had backed over the past year, at people who had been told no far more often than they had been told yes. I am not here tonight because of a courtroom, or a trust, or a number with 9 zeros behind it, she said. I'm here because I believe the most radical thing you can do, in a world that consistently underestimates certain kinds of people, is to keep showing up exactly as yourself, refusing to shrink, and trusting that eventually, the right room will finally see you clearly. It took me 14 years to learn that lesson. I'd like it to take the people in this room considerably less time than that. The applause that followed was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the particular, quiet applause of people who understood, completely, exactly what she meant. Later that same evening, after the showcase had ended, and the small crowd had scattered back out into the ordinary noise of a Queen's night, Maggie walked the 6 blocks back to the subway station alone, the way she preferred to walk most places now, unhurried, unaccompanied, entirely her own. She passed the laundromat. It was still there, remarkably, 11 years later, the same faded awning, the same flickering sign in the window, though the apartment above it had long since been renovated into something with a different tenant, living a different life entirely. She stopped on the sidewalk across the street for a moment, looking up at that window, remembering a 26-year-old woman standing at a hot plate, stirring rice, believing completely in a man who had not yet learned how to believe in her the same way. She did not feel bitterness looking up at that window. She had expected for a long time that she might, had braced herself for years for the version of this moment where old wounds reopened at the sight of something so specifically tied to her own naivety. Instead, what she felt, standing on that sidewalk in the fading light, was something closer to gratitude, strange as that seemed even to her. That apartment had made her. Not the version of her that eventually walked into a courtroom with a $5 billion trust behind her, but the version that came before it. The version who had learned to work hard for something without guarantee of reward, who had learned to believe in someone else's potential before the world agreed to see it, who had learned, eventually and at real cost, exactly what she was worth when nobody else was prepared to tell her. Her grandfather had understood something, sitting in his study 22 years earlier, drafting a clause that would sit dormant and unknown for over a decade, waiting for exactly the circumstance it was built for. He had understood that the greatest inheritance he could leave her was not simply money, though the money mattered, and she was not naive enough to pretend otherwise. The greatest inheritance was the chance to discover, entirely on her own terms, in her own time, exactly who she was capable of becoming when the world underestimated her completely. Everyone in that courtroom had laughed at her once. She had let them. Because she had understood, long before any of them did, that the people who laugh at a quiet woman in a worn cardigan are rarely paying close enough attention to notice the folder resting under her hand, the stillness in her posture, the particular, dangerous patience of someone who has already decided exactly how this story is going to end. She turned away from the old apartment window, pulled her coat a little tighter against the evening air, and walked on toward the subway, toward the rest of a life that belonged, finally and completely, only to her. If you found Margaret Hale's story satisfying, if you felt that particular relief of watching someone the world underestimated finally stand in their own power, you should know her story is far from the most shocking one we've covered. Not long ago, we told the story of a woman named Claire Whitmore, who discovered, almost by accident, standing just outside her own kitchen one evening, that the husband she had loved for 15 years had quietly taken out a life insurance policy in her name for an amount that made her blood run cold, and who overheard him on the phone that same night, saying words she would never be able to unhear, that she would be worth considerably more to him dead than she had ever been worth to him alive. What she did next will keep you on the edge of your seat from the very first minute. Click the next story on your screen and find out exactly how far she was willing to go to make sure his plan never had the chance to succeed.